Ex-analysts. Empowering analysts, transforming markets.
Hello, everyone. My special guest today is Brian Pieri. Brian is the founder of Energy Rogue. He's based in Colorado. He joins me from the US to really put a spotlight on the US markets and also what's happening in the Middle East from a different lens, from a different angle. Brian has more than 25 years of experience in oil and gas, worked on the many trading floors, and he is now bringing the passion of trading analysis, which is normally not available to other parts of the organization and businesses. I know Brian for many years and the special analysis and how he blends the technicals and the fundamentals together. So we'll dig deeper on US markets, how US-China deal, about the Hormuz opening up, how this whole war is going to affect the energy transition debate. So there's a lot to cover. Let's dig in. Welcome, Brian. Hi, Brian. Welcome to the Exploring the Energy Markets podcast and the hot topics I've been covering with various experts in the market. And really, I've been thinking for quite some time to have you on this podcast because there is so much happening in the Middle East, but there is so much happening in where you are in the US. I believe you are in Colorado. So let's start, Brian, by telling a little bit about yourself. I've given a bit of your intro, but there are some more interesting things in your profile which are worth sharing, especially relevant to the year. So welcome, Brian. Tell me about a little bit more.
Mukesh, thank you for having me, and thanks for having me on, because obviously right now is a very unique time in the energy industry, global trade, all that type of thing. So my name is Brian. I do live in Colorado. I'm in the United States, and in 2021, we launched EnergyRogue.com, and part of the reason that we did that is I spent over 2.5 decades on trading floors with companies like Chevron, Louis Dreyfus, Sumitomo, and I was surrounded by so much information and data that it made understanding the market from a fundamental sense, from a technical sense, remarkably easy. I'm not saying it was simple, but it made it a lot easier and approachable. And then when I left the trading side to go on the upstream side of the business and midstream side of the business, what I realized was there was a huge information gap. And one of the reasons I really like what you and your team do over there, Mukesh, is that providing perspective from an analytical point of view. There's a lot of numbers out there. Data is data, but it's not useful unless you synthesize it and actually create thought with it. What does this mean? Where have we come from? Where are we? Where are we going into the future? Because people can quantify particular data points. So it's not about data points, it's about synthesizing that into what is the translation of what that means? So we created Energy Rogue because we wanted a platform that was open access, that democratized the trading narratives. And so we put together into 2 products, Rogue Radar and Rogue Edge, both of them under $200 a month, is a synthesis of a market narrative, technical analysis, fundamental analysis, and all the supply points of view, demand points of view, storage points of view, and the macroeconomic narrative of the market so that you can understand where we were, where we are, and where we're going.
So that's fascinating, Brian. I really appreciate, because I think you have said it well, that trading is a privileged, trade floor is a very privileged place. I've been there 7 years in Houston on the Shell trade floor, and there is the amount of information, the amount of brainstorming and the thinking that is usually not there in other parts of any integrated businesses. So I think providing them for those is really commendable. But Brian, let's start. We are in interesting times. I think another deadline, 8 p.m. Eastern time, Tuesday. My Tuesday has already started. Is looming on us. And we have seen WTI above Brent. So give me a sense of what WTI is probably pricing, what Brent is pricing. And then I want to explore the theme of, is US really insulated? Has US done enough that US is not impacted and they're prepared for long war? I also want to talk about the other actors, Russia and China, if you have any views on it. And then I also see a theme, which I call, Brian, the WOPEC theme, how US is, yeah, Western Hemisphere kind of an OPEC equivalent, where how US is bringing all the Latin and the Canadians together to make a Western Hemisphere energy sort of a dominance. I want to explore that. And then in the end, you come from fossil industry. I come from long years in the fossil industry. And I think this oil price, this crisis, is bringing a narrative that maybe the answer is the renewables. And sometimes I think, no, not so soon, but I want to get your takes on how do you see post-war these two energy sources put. So there's a lot to talk, Brian, but let's start with your views on WTI and Brent, and where do you see, can you explain what has just happened and maybe an outlook as well?
Let's take them piece by piece. Okay, so the first question is, or the first commentary that we're going to talk through is WTI and Brent. So if we go back in time, in 2010, 2011, was when Brent shifted to become a premium to WTI. So that was when Brent, from a global trading perspective, started trading ahead of WTI. And it's really persisted that way since 2010, 15 years. 15 years, every day you're going to see Brent higher than WTI, with the exception of a few minor, well, I say minor, big events like 2008, like 2016, like when we have very big shifts. Now, let's go back to February 27th, before the attacks, wars, however you want to define the current circumstances with Israel, Iran, and the United States now in the mix. When the event happened, WTI and Brent was probably ahead of WTI by maybe $3. And then right after, the first trading day after this took place, both WTI and Brent traded up very sharply. I can't remember how much, but it was a very big move. But they moved up in tandem, and both traded around the same level for, I'd say, a day or two. I'd have to go back and look, but probably a day or two. And then Brent started taking the lead position and expanded from a $3 trade differential to up to $15 spread. So Brent traded up, and what has happened over this past week is that premium dissipated, and now WTI is ahead of Brent by $2 to $3. Now, the fact that this has persisted for multiple trading days, some of this can be explained away in rolls, contract rolls, things like that. I actually am looking a little bit deeper. There might be some other currency related issues that are impacting both Brent and WTI, because when you try to map this back to logical supply and demand, a big chunk of Brent oriented barrels are now not being traded, because there's over 20% of the global supply is backed up in the Strait of Hormuz, and some of it has been redirected, but not all of it. So a big block of trading barrels from a fundamental perspective are now no longer being traded on Brent. However, WTI-related barrels, nothing has really changed. All of the Western Hemisphere, or WOPEC, as you say it, I hope you brand that and trademark it, and like that. That is a brilliant way to look at it, because the Western Hemisphere is changing and emerging. If we go back 15 years, the Western Hemisphere was largely importing crude oil from the Middle East and various other places. Now, all of a sudden, the Western Hemisphere, between South America and North America, has a very interesting crude mix. But getting back to the point, I think the answer is going to be a to be continued. And I've classified with where we are right now, very similar to where we were in March of 2020 during COVID. We did not fully comprehend the supply and demand shock that we were in until months later, and in some cases, years later.
interesting comments. One I want to latch upon is that there was this news around U.S. might ban the crude exports that probably dropped WTI below Brent, and as you rightly said, it widened up to 15, and now we have seen a boomerang. Is there some sort of a risk, because U.S. barrels are probably the least risky barrels today to get hands on, right? Is there some sort of a special premium now WTI is commanding over Brent because of its much more safer barrel to have? And the second thought I also have is that maybe if you can talk about how US refineries are running so hard, I believe, and very high utilization, that is causing the WTI to stay strong. Is that kind of a theme there, or do you see any other factors?
Great question. And what I would say is, if you get back to your WOPEC term, I think that explains a lot, because the United States roughly refines about 60 million barrels a day, roughly produces, call it 13.5 million barrels a day, something like that. So you can look at it.
You want to show some radar or something? You mentioned earlier on, Brian, that you do
Absolutely.
a rogue radar. I'm just curious what it looks like.
This is exactly why we developed Rogue Radar, which gives market narrative, technical analysis. And what we do over on the crude side is we take a look at crude production right here, about 13.6 million barrels a day, as of the last report. And we take a look at crude imports and crude exports. What you'll notice here is in our refinery crude imports or inputs, we have about 16.3 million barrels a day of refinery inputs. But this net imports is satisfying the difference between crude production and refinery inputs, is our net imports. But I want you to notice we are exporting about 3.5 million barrels a day, but we're importing 6.4. And so when we're getting into that macro sense, and again, this is part of the reason that I did create Energy Rogue, is so that we could evaluate these metrics. And these are all the different things that we look at to synthesize the oil markets. But when you're looking at these markets, is the U.S. in a better situation and WTI being utilized globally when Middle East is shut in? Okay, there's a complicated nuance, and the complicated nuance is most of the production in the United States is coming from a newer resource that we figured out in the shale revolution with horizontal drilling, and it produces a light sweet crude. And that light sweet crude has a couple of advantages. It's cheaper to refine because it's lighter. However, the product slate that come out of a lighter crude does not give us as much of that middle of the barrel diesel, jet fuel, some of the heavier oils, synthetics that we're going to need out of there. Whereas the Middle East crude that is denser, that is sour, gives us a lot of these other elements that are super important. So what you can see is that we have a quality difference between WTI and the Middle East crude, because the Middle East crude has other components inside of it that are more expensive to refine. However, you get a different product slate that actually get a better bang for the buck. So does that make sense, Mukesh?
No. I think you're right that I mean I've spent my whole life in refining world.
Yes,
and I think so from that point of view, I always say that it's a crude quality, crude chemistry versus crude geopolitics, and chemistry will win, and chemistry is probably winning for quite some time. And so I think in that sense, you're right that US is refining a lot, very hard refining. So it's demanding a lot of crude oil, but it is also making the WTI sort of available. And probably the US crude production is also turning out to be flat, right? It has not responded. The drill, baby drill has not responded. That may be a part of the reason why WTI is commanding such a high value, because probably we don't have a lot. But any views on production? Views on drill, baby drill?
Well, I think, and I'm actually going to talk about both of those, because I think you pinpointed something that a lot of analysts miss, and a lot of analysts miss this out in the marketplace, because there's been a relatively flat production profile since 2023. There's been a small incremental growth year over year since 2023. Now, why 2023? Because in 2022, crude prices jumped up because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And because of that price uptick, a lot of producers were able to underpin drilling programs based upon higher price decks. And then what happened after that? The price came back down, elevated, kind of settled into the 60s, 70s, and kind of been range bound. But over the last couple of years, there's only been modest improvements in production volume year over year. And without sustained long-term higher price decks, you're not going to see the U.S. grow by leaps and bounds. It has the capability, but we're going to need to see probably $80 to $100 sustained. And this event could lead to that. Now, currently, 2027 is not priced that way. Brent is trading in the 70s, and even WTI is below 70 for 2027. So currently, traders in the marketplace are viewing this as a 2026 event. Now, it remains to be seen. Is that gonna happen? Well, there's a lot of questions, and this is where I think the context of we're in the beginning of this. This is going to have a 2 to 5 year impact on oil markets, on AI, on food. This is going to interface into a lot of different facets.
So I think my synthesis, Brian, what you mentioned is that Brent has lost a lot of the Brent-linked crude trading as well, whereas WTI is not growing a lot, and WTI is being needed a lot more at home because US is refining a lot as well. And WTI is being wanted by a lot of other people outside the US as less risky barrels because there is more assurance to come and get those barrels. With that in mind, I also want to ask you, Brian, sitting in Colorado where you are, looking at these numbers, looking at the entire US landscape, and US has done Jones Act waivers, US has done SPR release, US is also providing exemptions to drilling in the Gulf of America, and in the California space. So all these actions together, is US preparing itself for a long war? Is US sort of insulating itself from the global supply shocks? What's your take on those, and what you might say to the analysts to that don't forget to think about these kind of questions and factors?
No, and that's good. And it is part of the reason that we take a look at the technical side of the business, which is the trading side of the business, because of the trading side of the business trades futures contracts for WTI, for Brent. Most of the volume of that is not linked to fundamental physical supply and demand. And one of the things with your background on the refining side and with Shell, you realize that there is a supply and demand, and chemistry will always win. The trading side has unique relationships. So the WTI Brent has a currency relationship that is disconnected from all of that. Now, when we take a look at WTI and self-sustaining and WTI being exported, imported, okay, let me get back to something that you asked about before, which was drill, baby, drill. First term, there was a campaign speech that was drill, baby, drill. We're going to release all the crude and we're going to start to produce that. It was really coincidental timing. The reason that the United States grew so much production during Trump's first term had nothing to do with policy. Most of the policies that were removed for easing regulations on drilling in the North Slope, drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm still going to call it Gulf of Mexico the same way I'm going to call it Twitter. I'm just built that way, so I'm just going to call it that way.
So whatever, right? Yeah.
I'm not changing it. Like, I'm still going to call it Twitter. I'm still going to call it the Gulf of Mexico. So, but when we look at those policies eased drilling restrictions up in the North Slope in Alaska. They eased pipeline transport from Canada to the U.S., and they eased and relaxed regulations in the Gulf of Mexico. all of the crude oil growth during Trump's first term came from the Permian. But when we look at those policies eased drilling restrictions up in the North Slope in Alaska. They eased pipeline transport from Canada to the U.S., and they eased and relaxed regulations in the Gulf of Mexico. All of the crude oil growth during Trump's first term came from the Permian. None of those policies had a direct impact. It was purely economics. It was purely because the economic productivity out of the Permian was simply there. You could make a lot of money doing that. What's happened in Trump's second term is the economics aren't there. So relaxing this, the Jones Act, it's going to create minor dislocations in price. You can think about it this way. For instance, right now we have 20 million barrels a day that is not coming through the Strait of Hormuz, some of which is being shifted elsewhere, but not all of it. There's a large portion that has two options: fill storage or fill your stocks, fill your tanks, or shut in. And most of the tanks have already been filled, and they're shutting in now. So what that means is that there's a large portion that is not hitting the marketplace right now. But that also means that the Middle East has huge stockpiles while the supplying region is built with stocks. The consuming region is whittling down their inventory of that. So whenever this ends, when the Strait of Hormuz opens back up or is getting back to normalcy, we're going to see a dislocation of very big stockpiles in the Middle East and little stockpiles in the consuming regions. And there's probably not enough transport to bridge that gap. So these are things to think through on the after. Is we're going to have shipping rates that are probably going to be high for a sustained period. And the Jones Act and the exports and sanctions, these are really just going to change the economics and the economics and the flow patterns, not necessarily the destination on supply and demand. I don't know if that answered your question, though.
No. I think you hit on some of the nails that these changes will not have an immediate impact for the U.S., just like it happened in the first term. These might be a 2027 phenomena and may not be a 2026 phenomena. The 2026 would still be driven by the lower stocks in the consuming nations. Asia is short on oil. I'm sitting in Australia. We are really on a million barrels per day importing country. So we are short on oil. And then the Middle Eastern length, which is accumulated, there might be a tendency to balance fast. But you're right that the shipping and the congestion in the shipping routes and the rates might not allow the rebalance to happen very fast. So we might stay a little bit elevated even after the things cool off. Maybe another thread which I want to sort of explore, Brian, is around the fact that US-China deal. My view has been that Venezuela, Iran, and Russia and US actions on them is not really about these countries. If Venezuela was not selling to China, probably it would have been okay. If Iran was not selling huge discounted barrels to China, it would have been okay. If Russia is not selling, it's okay. So all the sanctions have resulted in China becoming the biggest beneficiary in the world. And I actually coined the term, another term called virus, right? Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and US. These four countries is created what I call the equivalent of COVID for oil markets. And we are seeing it spreading around, right? So my take is that from that point of view, US is trying to achieve this Western Hemisphere dominance. And in that, US does not want China to be in the backyard of the US in the LATAM side, right? So how do you see US-China to continue no deals, or you see some deals happen, or US will continue on the path of this Western Hemisphere integration? And I know that they had these meetings with all the Latin American presidents recently in Florida, I guess. So your take on US-China deal and how the Western Hemisphere dominance doctrine sort of evolves.
So I'm going to take you back in time to 2008 when
not many people can do it. So I love that.
when crude oil went to the highest level, 147. I forget what the decimal number was, but $147. I heard a great articulation on radio at the time, and there was a discussion about what does this mean? And during that time, during that price rise, the American consumer economy was driven on a lot of large SUVs that were very fuel inefficient. Okay, so they did not get many miles per gallon or kilometers per liter. Why the U.S. uses the imperial system is beyond me, but regardless, it was very fuel efficient cars. And during that price run up, you had large fuel burning vehicles traded in for smaller vehicles that were more fuel efficient, something you've seen in economies like in Europe and that or in Australia that has to be a little bit more fuel efficient rather than just the big car that feels nice because it's big. You had this massive shift from fuel burning cars to fuel efficiency because of the cost. And in this radio program, I heard one of the wisest things, and they were projecting that long sustained high crude prices will impact food in unexpected ways because much of the food growth, distribution, agriculture from growth to consumption is built around diesel, is built around the refined products that come out. And if you reduce the amount that you have there, it is actually going to have a direct impact on food. And the theory was for long sustained high oil prices, you are going to see more localization of agriculture. What's grown in Colorado was going to be consumed more. If we grow more peppers here, there's going to be more pepper dishes. So it makes a lot of logic sense. So when we're pulling that same thread back into a macro sense of where we are today, it makes sense for the Western Hemisphere to trade barrels among each other if the refining mix, if that chemistry is right, because there's light barrels, there's heavy. It is right. It's just the mixture is a little bit different. And historically, that mixture was involved with Middle East crude. Now Asia and the Middle East have that same mixture, and then you throw in Russia, you can see this chemistry mixture of different trading blocks of oil being dominant. And so I don't know what that means for geopolitics. I look at the fundamentals as far as, well, what makes sense on the chemistry, because we're not going to be able to change the chemistry. The geopolitics can be changed through diplomatic measures, hopefully. Unfortunately, there's not diplomatic measures that I wish there was more of that tool today because it impacts people's lives. Events like this are very traumatic for families, for countries, for people's lives, and this is messing with people's lives. We're talking about oil and economies and how that impacts. So when I pull that thread into a different thing, it makes logical sense that we are going to see a more regionalized trading block. And as you and I talked before we started recording, you brought to light a very important point. This is also more fuel efficient, less emissions. This is better for the environment. It's better for economies and the environment.
Now, I think you just elevated by connecting the food and the oil thing, that probably by doing this integration across from Canada, US, and US produces light oil, Canada produces heavy, Latin produces heavy, US has the best refineries, Latin doesn't have the refineries, so there's a natural synergy. And I also believe that the US probably wants all the renewables, the non-fossil work, which China was doing a lot more on the solar and batteries, to be done in Latin America. Because I did a podcast with Amanda Van Dyke, and I learned so much, Brian, in that the only reason why China became the factory of the world on the renewable side is because all the mining metals industry is one of the most toxic and hazardous things to do. So obviously now my view is that as US integrates Western Hemisphere dominance or integration, it will want to create the oil side up, but it will also want the Latin America to become the China next door, not the China too far away and geopolitically difficult to manage. So I think to me, Latin America could be the next China, becoming the factory of the world, and that's how the Western Hemisphere comes in. But okay, I mean, these are thinking thoughts, and I think this connection with the food and oil is probably very interesting, which will result in this regionalization.
Yeah.
So Brian, I think we talked about here and now, this war, WTI, Brent, US really operating in a very interesting way, its markets, right? And also this whole WOPEC idea. I also want to talk about in terms of how do you see renewables, right? Is this something like we have seen that US has blown the wind against the wind? I guess maybe that's the way to say it. And US wants more coal, US wants more of other things. But is it really changing that much, or this is more like the drill baby drill rhetoric, which may not come true, but US is also working a lot more on the renewable side, or really US is done and will focus a lot more on the fossil side. What do you hear? What do you see in your engagement with the market and the clients?
So I like looking at history and how it's relevant to today. And you may catch a theme here. So I'm going to take you back in time to when I started the energy industry in the mid-1990s. And I started around natural gas trading in the United States. And from the mid-1990s to 2010, there was a massive build out of new power plants that were fueled by natural gas. Now, a big reason why at the time in 1995, probably 30 to 40% of the US power was created from coal, which is not very environmental by rate of comparison to natural gas, and has a lot of nitrous oxide and things that aren't very good for the air quality. So there was a big push. And I was told in 1995, I said by the year 2000, the United States will burn zero coal for power. Here we are in 2026, we still burn about 13%. Now it's come down a lot, 30 to 40% down to 13, but nothing is going to replace that. Or I shouldn't say nothing is going to replace that. There's bold initiatives on the renewable side, and I applaud that for the environment. I think there's some practicality that when we're getting into complete reliance on renewables, if it gets cloudy, we may have blackouts or brownouts. When it gets, when there's not enough wind, we may have blackouts and brownouts. The U.S. Arguably is very intolerant to downtime when it comes to energy and electricity. We've gotten used to a lot of high uptime. If it's down for a couple hours, you have a lot of upset Americans that are very intolerant to that. But the fact of the matter is, our electric grid in the United States is not built for the type of technology that we're doing now. All the devices that we use nowadays weren't in existence when we built the electric grid in the United States. So, or let's put it this way, there's a lot of talk on EVs, electric vehicles. And if each neighborhood in the United States added 10%, replaced 10% of their gasoline burning or diesel burning fuel cars with Teslas, with EVs, the grid would become unstable. We would have blackouts and brownouts in that neighborhood. So that's with a 10% penetration. Our electric grid is not built for that because we built the electric grid around just-in-time electricity. And there has to be different services in energy storage, different technologies. And the fact of the matter is the renewables side is not the complete answer because there's going to be intermittent power as a result of that. Fossil fuels.
I can just share, Brian, that Australia, where I sit in, they are unable to find retiring a coal plant is risky by doing a lot of renewables. And now we are in a situation where we have too much renewables, but the coal plant still has to run. If we take down the coal plant, then suddenly the power volatility in Australia is about 500%. It can change in the day. And that power volatility leads to all the renewable players not earning a lot more, and they go out of the business. So the power volatility doesn't make the renewables people any profitable. And we also take the coal out. So I think the point you really bring, which I have not thought about, is this very little tolerance for downtime. And then US is probably doing in a more pragmatic way with the grid infrastructure it has. I guess that you were mentioning before that, yes, the oil side is harmful to environment, but the renewable side has its own issues. So I think there's a lot of truths and lies to be told on both sides.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the things that we were joking about before we started, which is the renewables side is pretending it's the complete answer and we're not going to have downtime. That's a falsehood. That's a lie. Stop lying. And the fossil fuel side is a believer that they're going to be the only answer, and that's the only answer, and that there is no impact to the environment. That's a lie. So the fact is, as a energy complex, if you look at the global energy complex, we are energy short. So how do we fill the energy gap? Now, there's different dislocations. Some places are energy long and become energy exporters, and some are energy short and become energy importers. So that becomes a transportation logistics. And the fact that you just tied in the coal and electric or the coal and renewables is a thread that is going to live on in a very common theme, because in the United States, we are heading rapidly because of the solar build out. Now you have so much of a power gap from the middle of the day when the sun is in the sky to 6 p.m. when the sun goes down, a big gap. And what fills that gap currently is coal, is natural gas, is other sources. Batteries are starting to make a dent. However, batteries, solar, they have environmental impact on the origination of the mining of the resources. So we have to be real objective about what we're trying to solve for when we're solving for these problems, because these are big problems. These are real problems. And when you look at the globe needs more energy. It's how to get it the most efficient way, the most economic way, the most environmental way, and with, as we were talking about on Western Hemisphere, the most logistical ease, and then create geopolitics layer around that. Now, you and I don't run the world. Maybe we should. I don't know. But I would like to see those be the center of energy policy for geopolitics.
I think you said it so well. Like, the truth lies, I guess, by stopping the two lies, right? The one that the fossil side does not have any environmental impact. I think that's not true. And equally, renewables can solve the complex human energy needs problems, not just in volumes, but in timing as well. They can solve the problem just like the fossil. That's also a lie. And
there's a way we can work together.
So I think to me, a fast transition is a failed transition. And that's what probably the Europe and rest of the world is finding. So, talking through, Brian, with you or for now quite some time in this podcast, what I'm building is that the way forward, the world, US is really trying to put a bit of pragmatic stinge into this thing by and also creating this energy dominance to solve the problem more regionally, which to me, a ship from Venezuela not going to China is environmentally friendly. It's not bad, right?
Right.
So I think that's how the things will shape. Now, to end our conversation, let's bring back to here and now. How do you see? I'm going to ask the question which everybody's bored of being asked and nobody has the answer. When is Hormuz opening?
Well, and this is where, okay, so one reason I always advocate that that people utilize different information sources. If you listen to only U.S. voices, you get one answer. If you listen to only this voice, you get a different answer. And I was asked about this recently, and they were talking about a tweet or a truth, whatever that is called, a post that that Trump made about the Strait of Hormuz and the escalation and whether or not there were peace talks. And I said, well, there's a couple different lenses to look at. You can look at what's being said, but you can also look at what's being done. And what's being done is some of the military pieces are increasing in the region. That indicates escalation or preparation for potential escalation. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it means it's a clue. It's circumstantial evidence of, probably should look deeper at this and look at different frames of reference. Now, prior to this event, there was probably 130 to 150 ships a day that would travel through the Strait of Hormuz. Couple interesting things, and this comes back to food. Not all of those ships were crude oil. 60% of the region's food comes in via the Strait of Hormuz. This is a humanitarian problem in the making because we are talking about food supplies that could impact the region from a very dramatic sense, and that doesn't impact just Iran. So this impacts Iraq, this impacts Kuwait, this impacts Saudi Arabia, this impacts UAE, everybody on the inside of Strait of Hormuz, this impacts. So when we're looking at this event, prior to this event, there was probably 130 to 150 ships a day that would travel. I think the last numbers I saw were maybe a dozen, and that Iran and Oman are talking about creating a system of a tolling, allowing particular ships to travel, either because of negotiated agreements or it could be a commercial arrangement, but it could also be a political arrangement as far as if the ship is tied to interests from Israel or the United States, that there could be problems with that ship traveling. So I think it's a to be determined, but one thing is very clear. When it's going to open, I don't know, because both sides are positioning for further escalation, which is not good for any human on the world, in my opinion. So I would like to see, as a human, a de-escalation of that event, but both the United States and Iran are looking from an escalation matching up to go. But one thing is very clear. When it opens, we're not going to be the same going forward. This is where we are in March of 2020 in COVID. We did not understand how the world was going to be permanently changed. For instance, remote work, dialing in remote, this podcast seemed more of a feat probably back in 2019. Now it's, hey, listen, you're in Australia, I'm in Colorado, let's hop on a podcast. Great, fantastic. It's old hat. It's what we do now. So there's a lot of things that will transpire that we don't fully understand yet. When it opens, if it opens today, we're going to be feeling the impacts of this for probably the next 2 to 5 years.
I think you build a little bit more conviction in my mind, Brian, and I would, if I have to make a view, my view would be that both sides will not back down, right, with the amount of preparation. It's an existential for Iran, and this is U.S. cannot lose this war, because then it reshapes the entire future direction of U.S. place in the geopolitics. So what might happen is that, as you rightly said, the humanitarian, the food crisis comes. So the Hormuz starts to open up for the non-fossil industry gradually. And that also proves that a system can work on the non-food, non-oil side, despite the war going on the land or in some other ways. And then that becomes the footprint or the blueprint to start opening up for some of the oil and gas. And even if you open Hormuz today, the assets in the Middle East are damaged. So it's not that Hormuz opening brings back the 20 million barrels back. No way, because a lot of the assets are damaged as well.
Right.
So I think if we really become very pragmatic, there is no magic bullet here. Hormuz will open slowly to non-food, non-oil, first food and other things, then probably slowly oil as the assets get repaired. And then only we can come back to the pre-war scenario. And that by the time that happens, a lot of the Asian countries would have gone into the COVID playbook times, and we might have to go through that bit of a pain. Even when the vaccination was found, COVID didn't disappear. So I think the same analogy, even if the Hormuz opens up, we are not going into the $40 oil price very soon. Okay. But,
no, I think you're right.
Yes, I think that's a fascinating conversation, Brian. I think we covered a lot of grounds, and I think I loved the way that you brought the point around bringing history, bringing perspective. And I think you've been on the floor and really now with this energy rogue. I really like the name, by the way, ER. It's kind of the ER, the emergency response for the markets. If you have a problem, do an oil ER.
Ooh, I like
call
that.
Brian.
You know what? For any naming, Mukesh has the naming rights for just about anything because WOPEC and what was the other one? It was WOPEC, and what was the other one?
The virus.
Yes.
The oil market virus. Venezuela,
Yes.
Iran, Russia, and US.
Yes, exactly. You get naming rights for everything now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Brian. Really pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I think we had a good fun talking about the markets. And I hope the listeners, this is not just about hard, concrete facts, but this is also about how to have a conversation about these tricky topics. And I think we two of us just did that in a certain way, which probably brings back some more empowering of the analysts. That's my mission with X Analysts. And as you can see, the logo also, this is all about Brian being a bow and arrow. And you and I have tried to become a bow for the younger aspirants, younger analysts today, that they can fire the arrows in the right way, because their arrows matter more than yours and mine now.
That's right. That's right. Well, Mukesh, thank you so much for having me. I greatly enjoyed it, and listen, anytime we want to talk energy, I'm all here for it. So I appreciate you having me, and this has been wonderful. And what you're doing is a wonderful mission. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Brian. Cheers.
Cheers.